Hello readers, your learning target this week is the second part in making connections. Remember, making connections means good readers make personal connections to the text by using their schema. So the first connection we practiced and studied was text-to-self connections. This week we are going to practice making text-to-text connections. Remember, using your schema means to use experiences and what you already know to make sense of the text. Meaning everyone brings a different schema to the books they read because schema is your background knowledge. It's shaped by your experiences, the people you know, and the books you have read. So let's highlight that part. And the books you've read. And I'm going to stop there because a text-to-text connection focuses on and brings out all of the things we have read. And that includes books that have been read to you. So all of our book of the days are places we can make text-to-text connections. It also includes media. Things you've seen on TV, like the Discovery Channel, or magazines you've read. So it's all aspects of things that we have read. So we're going to use our schema and the books that we've read to make text-to-text connections. So a text-to-text connection, first let's define what that is. A text-to-text is making a connection between a text and another text you have read. So think about one text. We're going to connect it to another text. So that's where the text to text comes from. One book connected to a second book. And it often could be just more than one book. Maybe there's 3 books that are connecting, as long as it's one text to another. So your success criteria, your target this week, is that you can use your schema to make text-to-text connections while you read. How will you do that? Well, step 1, you will use what you know to understand what you read. 2, we're going to compare and contrast how one text is similar and different to another text. So hear those again. You're going to use what you know to understand what you read. Secondly, we're going to compare and contrast how one text is similar and different to another text. So let's review what is compare and contrast. When we compare something, it's how 2 or more things are alike. When we contrast something, it's how 2 or more things are different. So in our minds, we might be making a list. So we notice our characters, our settings, and our events, and we begin to compare how they're the same, how they're different, and how together they are the same. Or our minds might list them in separate ways. So what exactly are we comparing that's alike and contrasting that is different? Well, we are comparing and contrasting our story elements. We're comparing our characters. We're comparing our setting. We're comparing our themes, which are our lessons, the author's lessons in the story. We're going to compare the events, the problems and solutions. So all those relationship things in our stories, we are comparing, we're noticing how they are alike, or we find ways they are alike. We also pay attention to how things are different between all of these things from book to book. So we also find ways things are different. So a story element, remember, are the parts of a story. So our characters, our setting, our problem and solution, our theme, which is the big message or lesson in the story, and our plot, which is our events. We're taking all of these parts of a story and we're noticing we get engaged in our mind to think about how they are alike and how they are different from book to book. So some prompts that we could use in order to do that. What we're thinking about is, what I just read reminds me of this story or text because. Or this book reminds me of the book because. The way this story is written reminds me of the book because. Or we can think about characters, and it makes us make text-to-text connection. So you see this one's highlighted for me. So I'm going to show you how one character reminded me of another character from the book. And I'm going to tell you why. Or another way you could say it is blank is similar to the book, because. So you're comparing two books. Notice none of these prompts are focused on you personally, because this week's connections are text-to-text connections. The next one says, I remember something like this happened in the book. So both the stories connect because. Or this part of the story reminds me of when in the book, and then explain. The event is like the event in. The ideas in this text are similar to the ideas in this book because. Or you'll see my second one that's highlighted is these two stories, blank and blank, are alike because. So I tell you the names of the two books and I explain why they are alike. Lastly, the character in this story is like the character in, and I explain why. So while you're reading today, think, how are the texts you are reading similar and different to each other? Think about what about the story reminds you of another story you have read. So while your mind is engaged, work on comparing and contrasting the story elements in your stories. So for example, readers, we have read Stand Tall, Molly Lou Melon. We're going to compare and contrast Molly Lou Melon to The Invisible Boy. The things that stood out to me when I was comparing and contrasting, when I was thinking of the story elements, their characters, the settings, where and when it happened, the problems of what was going wrong and how they were solved, the messages of the story, and the events or what happened in the story. So as I think about these story elements and I think about how they're alike and different, the things that stood out to me the most when I compared them were their settings, some of the events in the stories, the two characters, so Molly and Brian, and the lessons. So the prompt that I used is, these two stories remind me of each other because. And so you noticed back here, one of the ones I had highlighted was these two stories. So these two stories, Molly Lou Melon and The Invisible Boy, are alike because. So now, here is my response. So now I put it in a complete thought and explain what it is that I am comparing and contrasting. So these two stories, Molly Lou, Stand Tall, Molly Lou Melon, and The Invisible Boy, these two stories remind me of each other because both stories mostly take place at school with characters who feel left out, but have a talent like stacking pennies and drawing. And both stories teach us about being kind to everyone and making others feel noticed. So I compared the setting because I noticed those were similar. I noticed an event, things that were happening and that built on each other in the story. And part of this would also include a problem. One of the problems in the story was similar. So I told you that they felt left out, and that is part of the problem. I talked about each character and the lessons for us as readers that we take away from the characters. All of that in 2 to 3 complete sentences. And sentences that make sense, readers. As you are typing and writing out your response today, don't just write 2 to 3 complete sentences. You want to use the prompt that best fits the books you are comparing. But also make sure that what you write, you're going to want to reread it to yourself and think about what exactly are you comparing and contrasting. And when you write it out, make sure it has information from the story. Because it shouldn't just come from your mind. Because a text-to-text connection has specific information from each text that you are trying to communicate. So let's look at a second one. A second one, I am going to compare and contrast Stand-Tall Molly Llewellyn and Wilbur. The two things that I thought about when I was comparing and contrasting, when I was like, oh, that book reminds me of that book. It's because of the characters and because of the lessons. The prompt that I used is this character reminds me of this character from the books because. So the books I'm using are here. So the response I started with, the prompt is Molly Lou, so character, reminds me of character, Wilbur, because. And here's my complete thoughts. Oops. Molly Lou reminds me of Wilbur because they both are unique, creative, and brave. They teach us how important it is to always believe in yourself, but to also be brave, to always be who you are, instead of changing for others. Even if they make fun of you or get jealous or mad at you, that's supposed to be mad, it's important to be happy with who you are. To be happy with who you are and let's get off that E right there. Oh, goodness. Okay, so let's hear that again. Because I hear 2 to 3 complete sentences that make sense, that compare and contrast two characters and their lessons, because that's, for me, how I made a text-to-text connection between these two stories. So Molly Lou reminds me of Wilbur because, so it's going to be important as you make your text-to-text connection today that you use a prompt and you support it with because, and you give us the ideas from both stories and how you connected them, what they reminded you of each other. So both books should remind you of something that they have in common, if that's the characters or the lessons. Molly Lou reminds me of Wilbur because they both are unique, creative, and brave. They teach us how important it is to always believe in yourself, but to also be brave but to also be brave, to always be who you are instead of changing for others. Even if they make fun of you, get jealous, or mad at you, it's important to be happy with who you are. And notice that I'm specific about those traits that I learned about from the stories because I compared characters and lessons. So readers, today, on the part 2 of your lesson, it is going to be your turn. You're going to stop and think and make a text-to-text connection, meaning you're going to compare of how what's the same and different between one text to another text. So you're going to have to get your thinking cap on. And it'll look like this. Your success criteria is you're going to use your schema to make text-to-text connections while you read. Compare and contrast how one text is similar and different to another text. And I will read you the directions on your activity. You will have prompts that you're going to highlight. And then you have a choice from all these different, and this isn't even close to all the book of the days we have read this year. You are going to study and think and remember some of our book of the days and find 2 that you could make a text-to-text connection to, thinking about the story elements. How are they the same in their events, in their characters, and in the lessons? And then type out your text-to-text connection using one of the prompts. You got this, readers. Happy connecting.